Hi, this is period 5, lesson 2, manifest destiny. This time period is 1844 to 1877. Our lesson, the objective, by the end of the lesson, you should be able to explain the causes and effects of westward expansion. Pretty straightforward. Why did we want to expand? What are the effects of our expansion? Our first key concept. You are to explain why the desire for access to natural and mineral resources and the hope for economic opportunities or religious refuge led to an increased migration. There are certain factors that promoted early Western migration. So we're going to set our attention to the Northwest corner of America, what was known as the Oregon Territory. The Oregon Territory was jointly occupied by the American nation and the British. And it was the northernmost border of the Louisiana Territory. This area was very poorly defined. It wasn't really sure where our land stopped and their land began. We were jointly occupying it. So keep in mind, there were very, very few British settlers who lived in the territory because it was so far from their main Canadian settlements in the east. In the United States, the earliest settlers to the Oregon Territory were American missionaries who sought to convert the natives to Christianity. So that's what gets them out there, and they begin creating communities. These early religious missionaries carved a path, a wagon trail, so to speak, across the entire Louisiana Territory from Missouri all the way to Oregon, and this is called the Oregon Trail. It becomes the main highway, so to speak, for the cross-continental travel. I'm sure many of you remember playing that computer game when you were younger, the Oregon Trail. You'd load your family up, your virtual family into the wagons. So that's what gets them out to Oregon. But again, it's still very sparsely settled. Later pioneers begin to travel to the Oregon Territory. These are the trappers and the mountain men. They wanted to take advantage of one of the most important commodities, the most important animals on the American continent, the beaver. They could be trapped and their skins were sold. This was a high fashion item where their skins were in high demand because they were completely waterproof. The big black hats that we see someone like Abraham Lincoln wearing, traditionally they were made out of the beaver pelt, which is naturally water repellent. It was the Gore-Tex of the 19th century, so to speak. The later trappers begin to call themselves the mountain men because they survive by assimilating into the wilderness. They survive by building onto the wilderness skills and learning things from the Native Americans. So they are the very first settlers. This is in the 1820s, 30s, and the early 1840s. Moving on, why that area becomes of great concern. The idea is called manifest destiny. If you were an advocate for acquiring Western land, you argue that it is our destiny to manifest, to spread throughout the entire continent. A newspaper editor began publishing a series of articles where he writes for expansion. He said it was a manifest destiny for the United States, that God wants us. We are God's chosen people. Keep in mind, this ties in nicely to that idea of American exceptionalism, that we are indeed chosen. And when this newspaper editor creates these articles, it begins a national frenzy. People read it, people grow enamored with the idea. So letter B, in the name of manifest destiny, Americans get caught up in this patriotic cause, and they begin to demand things from their government, from the U.S. government. So targets of manifest destiny. Number one, Oregon. We're going to annex Oregon. All of it from the British. This included even parts of what are Canada what is Canada today. We wanted to take the island of Cuba from the Spanish. So these are the targets: Oregon, all of it, Cuba from the Spanish, and we want to acquire the southwestern corner of North America from Mexico. Southwestern corner meaning the modern states of New Mexico, Arizona, California. Moving on to letter C, manifest destiny and politics. Manifest destiny was very popular among the Democrats. It was very popular among working class people because they wanted that land to expand for them to realize the American dream. While it was popular with the Democrats, it was not as popular with the Whigs and the elite gentlemen. They opposed this idea as being too risky. The middle class was pretty evenly divided. So as you can see, manifest destiny does become a political issue, and it leads to many other things, as we're going to see. Our next key concept: westward migration is boosted during and after the Civil War because the federal government creates laws that promote westward transportation and economic development. So creating pull, what's going to pull people? During the Civil War, Congress and Abraham Lincoln approved two significant laws that are going to really stimulate the pull of the West to Northerners. The first was the Transcontinental Railroad. Federal funding was committed to two railroad companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, to build a transcontinental railroad to connect the eastern United States to California and all the land in between. The federal government gave these two railroad companies, the Central Pacific and Union Pacific, land to grant however they wanted. So they received free land from the government, and they also received monetary bonuses to build the most tracks. So it becomes a competition. And once the railroad is there, people are able to move west and goods are able to be shipped back and forth. The second law, to encourage settlement and farming in the West, the federal government sells lands very cheap. It's called the Homestead Act. A homestead is a piece of land. You were able to get 160 acres for a pittance, for just a few dollars, provided that you stay on the land and you farm it. So if you were working class in the East and had no hope of owning land in the East, of course you were going to move west. If you were a recent or even not so recent immigrant and your prospects looked dim, of course you were going to go west. This is why people end up in the states like Kansas and Nebraska and places like that. If you wonder why people are living there. Moving on, our next key concept is to explain why U.S. interest in expanding trade leads to more ties with Asia. The commercial leaders during this time want to grow the American economy. They know that our future is not just in the United States. There's really not a lot of room in the United States to increase trade across the Atlantic. So looking at number one, Atlantic trade, these routes were already long established and dominated by Europe. If you backtrack all the way to the colonial era sees the triangular trade. So if we seek to expand, our future for trade is in the Pacific region. Keep in mind, European powers were already slowly establishing trade monopolies. So we needed to act quick or we were going to be left out. So in the 1850s, Commodore Matthew Perry leads an expedition